which is what, over the years, your elders would always say, don't go to Minneapolis. The traffic is terrible. So anyway, I've done a lot of work on treaties, and in the process, I think the main thing I've learned is, how do you tell people about treaties? And, because I don't know that treaties are widely understood, but it's, so where do I start talking about treaties? I guess I would say, in all the years that I've been working on treaties in different parts of the country, the thing that I've learned is you gotta tell stories. Because telling, I could talk about, well, so the treaty signers met in Washington and they talked for 10 days and they, and then these various provisions that were in the treaty, and it could go on and on. But in the case of this book, I tried to make it more about the Mille Lacs Band, the people who signed the treaty, and what they went through after the treaty, because it sort of fits the stereotype that many people talk about, the trail of broken treaties. The treaties that the Mille Lacs Band signed were pretty good treaties, but people, including some of the people who negotiated the treaty, tried to figure out ways to break it. Even the people who produced a treaty, even though they wanted to, it's like they wanted to break it from the beginning. People like, well, my friend Kevin here will know the name Henry Rice. Henry Rice was the negotiator of the 1855 treaty that the Mille Lacs Band signed that gave them the reservation in the first place. And then he negotiated the 1863 treaty in which he tried to take it away from them. And, he was I've called him various names. I'll just say he was a stinker. That's kind. It's kind to say he was a stinker. Because never mind what I've said in the past. I gave a presentation at the History Center, and I'm surprised they didn't send for the police, because of the way I talked about Henry Rice. And I was working on a study of Henry Rice, and I got a pretty small grant that the people around the Historical Society refer to as the White on Rice Project. So, anyway, some of the people in this room said it. Anyway, so I think that the point about this book is that I've tried every way I can to tell it from the point of view of the Mille Lacs Band members. And that's for one very important reason that Sandra Day O'Connor emphasized in that opinion, Supreme Court opinion that she wrote in 1999, that when you analyze treaties and other negotiations between native tribes and the U.S. government, you have to present it with the understanding, or trying to get at the understanding of the people who signed it, the signers, the Indian people. You can't just say, well, here's this treaty in this English language, and we can just interpret it because we know English. That's not the way it works. You have to think about what they understood. And I found in some of my research that, even when I tried to do that, the federal officials who were also there agreed with the band members about what the treaty meant. So the Treaty of 1855 created a reservation for the Mille Lacs Band containing the south shore of Lake Mille Lacs, which most of you probably know is in north central Minnesota. It's the largest, would you say the largest the largest inland lake in Minnesota, because there are other lakes like possibly the Boundary Waters lakes that, if you, depending on where you stopped, you'd end up with maybe a similar quantity of acreage in the water, but it's connected to all these other lakes, so it's hard to say exactly where it stops. The Mille Lacs, Lake Mille Lacs is not all contained within the Mille Lacs Reservation. The Mille Lacs Reservation contains 61,000 acres at the beginning. And through the course of the years after the Treaty of 1855, the actual land owned by the Mille Lacs Band members was shrunk and shrunk and shrunk through the connivance of lumber companies and the state of Minnesota with the help of federal officials also. So originally the purpose of a reservation is to provide what they call the permanent home, a permanent home for an Indian tribe that they could always call their own, and nobody could come in and take it. And that's a fine idea, if only the promises weren't broken by people like Henry Rice. So over the years, they figured out ways to take it away. And of course, one thing I have to remind people is that reservations do not have to have land entirely owned by a tribe. So for example, the White Earth Reservation in northwestern Minnesota is frequently called a checkerboard because over the years land was taken from them by lumber companies, and so the actual land owned by the Indians shrank and shrank and shrank. And the same thing happened at Mille Lacs, but in the end, they still had a reservation, because the only way you could take away a reservation is through an act of Congress. Treaties are, I've read this in many contemporary documents. Treaties are the law of the land, because once negotiated, they're passed in congressional acts. And you can't just say, well, federal officials made a few decisions and so it's not really a reservation anymore. No, that's not the way it works. Congress has to specifically take away the status or disestablish the reservation. And it has to be something that's entirely understood by band members. So you can't just argue from inference. Inference is not the way you take away something that's the law of the land. You can't take it away through presidential order, for example. None of that's possible. So, but yet over the years from, the Treaty of 1863, in which there was an attempt to take away the reservation, up till till the last 10 years, the state of Minnesota kept saying, well, we don't really think they have a reservation anymore. So it wasn't until Well, I think it was under Attorney General Ellison, who agreed with the Mille Lacs Band that the reservation still existed. And the Solicitor General of the United States issued an opinion saying the reservation still exists. And so, at that point, the Mille Lacs Band was in court making the case that the reservation still existed. And it was a court case for which I wrote a report, which was one version of this book. That, so they went to federal court in St. Paul, and they won the case. And although, the county of Mille Lacs, which contained a high percentage of people who were against the Mille Lacs Band, still intends to appeal. So who knows? It could go on for another several generations. Who's to say? But, so this story in this book is about how the Mille Lacs Band resisted every attempt to take away their reservation. And it's a long story, but I think it's pretty interesting because there's a story involved. It's about the people, and I did an examination of which band members lived in which parts of the reservation, and how the lumber companies figured out ways to steal the land. And since we're in Minneapolis, I should mention that one of the individuals who was most active in stealing the land and timber of the Mille Lacs Band was T.B. Walker, the founder of the Walker Art Center. I was giving a talk in October, and I said, let's all go picket the Walker Art Center and demand that the Mille Lacs Band get its art back. Because of course the timber paid for the T.B. Walker's fortune, and that's how he bought the art. So I don't think that the Mille Lacs Band wants some of that art, especially any conceptual art that they might have. At least that's my opinion. But anyway, so I wouldn't say it's just Minneapolis. In St. Paul, we can say that in addition to Henry Rice, one of his neighbors on Summit Avenue, the richest street in St. Paul, was Amherst Wilder. The great humanitarian, Amherst Wilder, helped steal the timber of the Mille Lacs Band from their reservation. The two of them, Walker and Wilder. Walker and Wilder. It has a ring to it, doesn't it? And then there was a man in Stillwater who manufactured freight cars named Dwight Sabin, who was a logging, what would you call him? A logger, a lumber company guy. Anyway, and he was in partnership with Wilder, and at one point he got himself elected to the Senate from Minnesota. In those days, senators were elected by the state legislature, and so he got himself elected to the Senate and was able to use political influence to just enforce his ownership of the timber, of the stolen timber. So anyway, these are part of the cast of characters in addition to the Mille Lacs Band members. I think that one thing I really enjoy when I'm doing research is to try to find places in the written record where you can hear the voices of the Mille Lacs Band members or of any Indian people, because it's hard to imagine that it's possible. You're reading the records of a treaty or some other document, and you think, well, this is all written in the voice of the federal officials, and so, but sometimes you can find places where you're reading along and suddenly the voices of the people just jump out at you from the written document. And I tried to use as many of these as I could. I don't know, I was gonna read a couple of these. Well, here's a really interesting metaphorical statement by Indaso Gizik, whose name means every day. That's what his name means. And he, in one point along the way of this story is that there's a case in the Court of Claims where the Mille Lacs Band was able to sue the federal government to enforce the agreements, one of the agreements they'd signed. And depositions, just amazing number of depositions in which, although they're written in English, they were interpreted by band interpreters, and so this is not an Ojibwe, but it's the metaphors are present in the translation. So he talks about when the settlers started to come into the reservation, because first of all, the lumber company stole the timber, which opened the way for the settlers to come in and claim land all over the reservation. So he says, instead of moving them off, they came onto the reservation in big swarms, like mosquitoes, and settled there after the treaty was signed. When you got a mosquito bite on your finger, it only stings you a little while, but these white people, when they came there and took possession of all our property, our little gardens, even our blueberry patches, we could not pick our blueberries there. They drove us out of our rice fields. We could not get our rice. They would not let us pick our rice there. For myself, I know that I had a little house built there and a little garden. I was driven twice out of my little house. They did the same thing to all the Mille Lacs Chippewas. Even they went so far in our little villages, they came around and drove us away. But when we didn't go, they would take our household stuff and set it on fire and drove us away and scattered us all over. There's more than one example of people setting fire to their villages. And in some cases, the people who did that were the county sheriff and his men would come in a gang, and they would just start gathering them together and moving them off and then setting fire to their houses. And, some of these were not the old-fashioned traditional wigwam of the Ojibwe. They were log houses sometimes. And so here are these guys burning down villages. And, you could get stories of these in the local newspapers. It was almost as though they were proud of it, because they constantly said they shouldn't be here. They should go to their own land, which was their metaphor for the White Earth Reservation is their own land, even though they had lived at Mille Lacs for 150 to 200 years. So there are many examples of this. I've got a chapter called The Burning of Villages, and then a later chapter called More Burned Villages. So, I don't know how anybody could read this and not be affected by it. As a white person, somebody would say, oh, you're just feeling guilty. No, I'm not feeling guilty. I'm feeling angry. when I read this, when I see this happen. It just seems, kind of disgusting. And the role of the sheriff is interesting because one of the reasons this case went to court was that the Mille Lacs County Sheriff would not cooperate with law enforcement on the reservation. The band had the right to police the reservations. For example, if there were drug dealers who came in and they had a right to do that, and they would, I think I heard in the less than 10 years ago, the band had arrested some drug dealers and called the county sheriff to turn them over. And the county sheriff said, "No, we're sorry. We don't recognize your legal authority. You just have to let him go," they said. So that was one of the motivations for the case to go to court. And so that was one of the issues. I wanted to read another case, another story. Well, here's from a petition. There were many petitions because the Mille Lacs band had friends in some of the local communities, like white communities, like Little Falls, for example. And the people there helped them write petitions to send to Washington. And here's an example that seems to carry some of the voices of the Mille Lacs band members. It says it's addressed to the either the Commissioner of Indian Affairs or the President. It says, "We, your children," you know, in those days, they used to call the President our father, or the Commissioner of Indian Affairs was their father in a more metaphorical sense. It says, "We, your children, the Mille Lacs band of Chippewa Indians, desire to make known to you our grievance and ask you to assist us, so that we shall not be driven from our homes without having done any wrong to our white brothers and neighbors. In the summer of 1862, when other Indians made war on the whites, we stood by them and offered to fight with them against our own people." In this case, there was one band of Leech Lake, Ojibwe, led by Hole-in-the-Day, which threatened to collaborate with the Chief Little Crow in making war against the Dakota chief, making war. But the Mille Lacs band said that they wouldn't do it. They were going to uphold the relationship they felt they had developed with the U.S. government. And in the summer, we stood by them and offered to fight with them against our own people for our kindness. Our great father in Washington and the great and good men with him who ruled this great nation made us a promise that we should inherit our home on the beautiful and to us lovely Mille Lacs forever, so long as we behaved ourselves well towards our white neighbors. We hear that many false accusations have been made against us and sent to our great father. If such is the case, we hope you will not be deceived by them and drive us from our home without giving us a chance to be heard. So, see, the Treaty of 1863 had essentially taken away the reservation, but it stated that the Mille Lacs band could stay at Mille Lacs as long as they treated whites well. And so that's what they, and so that was the understanding. But in the years that followed, there were constant complaints saying, 60 miles away, somebody would write and say, the Indians came and their dogs barked at us, and they shot arrows at our dog, and they scared the women folk, because, and they would always use the memory of 1862 and involvement of the Dakota to suggest that the Mille Lacs Ojibwe were going to bring the war to the whites again. So it's a long and sad story, a very sad story. And as I said, it makes me angry when I read about it. But, you know, so at one point, the US government thought they had gotten them to agree to finally sell all claim they had on the reservation and move to White Earth. This was in 1889. And once again, the connivance of Henry Rice was involved. And they said, well, if you sign this document, you will be paid for any claim you have on the land, and then you can get allotments. You know, in those days, that's just the whole point of many agreements in that time period, was to give them small parcels of land, as opposed to, you know, the full joint ownership of all the land, like they held out for at Red Lake in northwestern Minnesota. The Red Lake man still owns all the land in joint tenancy. So he said, just sign this. And, you know, Henry Rice said, well, I know you agreed before that you could always remain here as long as you behaved, but just sign this, and then, you know, some of you should go to White Earth because it's better for you. We want you to be farmers, and there's better farmland there. So you sign this, and then you'll get allotments. And they never got allotments. Because, let's see, what's another word for Henry Rice? A shady individual. Anyway, so he was not able to deliver on it. They never got the allotments until 1925. They got allotments. Now remember, their original ownership of that reservation was 61,000 acres. When they finally got allotments, they averaged for each family something like 7 acres. So in all, it's a couple hundred acres for the people who are still there. So it's, you know, and then, let's see, in the 1930s, under the Indian Reorganization Act, they found ways to get them more acreage. But once again, you'll read a point, and I'll say in there that it seemed that every time something good happened for them, the white people who lived in places like Isle would complain about it. How dare you let them have this land? This is outrageous, they said. And this is an attitude that sadly has continued up to the present day among certain people in Mille Lacs County. So it's a long, terrible story. And the point is that they kept fighting. And I end the book with I probably shouldn't read the last line in the book, because where's the suspense in that? But it's a wonderful statement by a guy I met this guy in let's just say in the previous century, 1998, I think I went to see him. And he lived in a little parcel of land on the south shore of the lake in a place called Cove, where his father and his grandfather, they were members of a band under the leadership of Chief Wadena. And he had to go to court, and so once again he had a deposition that he was going to present in court, and it said, and Melvin Pewash was his name, Melvin Pewash, the grandson of Pewash, who was still living on the land in 1998, like generations before him, he had been taken to court more than once, but he would not leave the land on which his ancestors had lived, and where many of them had been buried. In one court filing, Melvin Pewash stated, "The Pewashes have lived on this land since previous removal from another piece of land in the early 1920s. Before my father, Jack Pewash, died, he told me to stay here, to keep this land for the Indians. If someone didn't stay there, the white men would take it away. I cannot and will not give it up." So, unknown to me at that time, people were working in the legislature in Minnesota, and they managed to get the government to give the land back to the Mille Lacs Band. So they got the land. I wish I'd, yelled, "Stop the presses!" But I couldn't. So, it was sad, but anyway, it was a great step. Things are changing, but as far as Mille Lacs County is concerned, they stay the same, sadly. So, that's just a quick first tour of the book, and so I'm hoping you might want to pick it up later, and I'm willing to answer questions, even difficult questions. So, does anyone have any questions?
I have a question. In the book, I noticed that often it was people from Little Falls that would be advocating for the Mille Lacs Band.
Yeah.
Why do you think that community acted that way?
Well, I think it was because they had a trading relationship with many Mille Lacs hunters, and they were the closest town which had any sympathy. The worst set of scoundrels lived in the town of Princeton, which is, if you're going up 169, Princeton is after Zimmerman, which is after Elk River. And, when I was a kid, my grandparents lived in Zimmerman, and we used to go up to Princeton all the time, and I would go in the drugstore and buy baseball magazines. And, I always thought it was kind of a nice town. There was a Dairy Queen. It was a kind of cool town, but, 75 years before, they had a newspaper with an editor who was just vehemently anti-Indian. So, but the people in Little Falls were pretty kind to them and helped them write their petitions and send their letters, and they even wrote their own letters to the federal officials. So, my answer is pretty much, why were they nicer to them? Because they just were, maybe. They had a business relationship with them, but that doesn't always explain things. The people in Princeton didn't have much of a relationship with them. The Princeton newspaper occasionally would carry news from Mille Lacs Lake, and they were it's just disgusting. Occasionally you'd see a column headlined, "Another Good Indian," which is a report on the death of a band member. Because, of course, they thought the only good Indian was a dead Indian. Doesn't that make you mad? I don't know. I've never talked about this to people who live in Princeton. I'd have to say, I used to like this town, but I didn't know very much. Anyway, so there were other questions.
This Henry Rice, what was his background? Why was he so involved? What did he stand to gain from it?
He was
It's a squeaky wheel, it needs grease.
that's Henry Wright for you. He had been an Indian trader, which is, he used to trade, but he was also a specialist at getting contracts from the federal government to do things, like remove Indians from one place to put them somewhere else. He did that with the Ho-Chunk tribe before he came to Minnesota, and then he came to Minnesota and he tried to figure out ways to do it in other ways. I mean, at one point in the book I say that Henry Rice was convinced that he was convinced that he could easily persuade Indian people to do things that he wanted them to do, even when it was against their own interests. So he had a strong belief in his own, charm, somehow. And in those days, somebody like that would be, other white people would say, well, he's such a friend to the Indians, they would say. Which was, you read all the facts and you think, that's kind of bullshit. He's no friend to them. I mean, the way he cheated them out of allotments, for example. It was just, but, I've sometimes said, well, he's of the class of characters like Alexander Ramsey, the negotiator of the Dakota Treaty of 1851, who was another scoundrel. And I'm saying that as somebody who went to Alexander Ramsey High School in Roseville. And for a while I've been saying, yes, I attended war criminal Ramsey High School many years ago. Well, it's no longer Ramsey High School because it's now called Roseville Senior High. Not because they were ashamed of it, but because they were gonna drop one of the high schools, and there was a Kellogg and there was a Ramsey. And the Kellogg people would not have the remaining high school be not named Kellogg, so that was just to avoid controversy in Roseville. Anyway,
Bruce, what's the current state of the ownership as far as the band having the land versus the white citizens who maybe had gained it through allotment? Is there a process for trying to buy land back, or is
oh yes, yeah, they've been able to buy land back, and they have more money now because of having, well, they have a casino at Mille Lacs and they have a casino at Hinckley. So, and so they have the money to do lots of things. In the book I tell the story about how the band leaders went to St. Paul in the fall of 1862 to meet with the Indian agent. And the Indian agent tried to get them a room to stay at a local hotel. And the hotel keepers would not rent them a room. And, so they're waiting around to get a room, and a bunch of German immigrants start throwing rocks at them because they thought they were Dakota. Now, in the book I point out that many Mille Lacs band members have ancestry who were Dakota, but, they were clearly not Dakota in the sense of involving in the Dakota conflict of 1862. So, I pointed out in the book, in the wonderful example of payback they couldn't get a room in the city at Christmas time in 1862. But in, what was it, 2012, they purchased two of the biggest hotels in the city. So isn't that an interesting fact? Now, they can say who can stay in those hotels, maybe, I don't know. But anyway, it's a, you know, if you were writing a novel, you'd say, yeah, that's exactly what I would have happen. They'd get to own the hotels, and they'd own the Whites. And I say that as somebody named White, so, you know. Michael.
I haven't read the book yet, but I see there's a chapter in here about lake fishing, and I
Yes.
suspect there's a lot of history that most of us don't know, but we all know the walleye is sort of sacred to settler fishermen.
Walleye
and
is king.
right, and a lot of what makes Mille Lacs, you know, kind of in a settler imagination, our place
Yeah.
isn't sort of about timber resources and stuff like that. It's about like
Right.
the place at the lake, or the shack that we go to in the winter, and
Yeah.
all that sort of stuff.
And that was not an immediate thing. I mean,
Mhm.
the first, the lumbermen, then the settlers, then came tourism. So that's the sort of course of events. And the lake fishing chapter is about what happened during World War I. In World War I, there was a demand to send meat to the soldiers fighting in Europe. And so I can't remember whether it started with the federal government or who it was, but they said, we need to encourage people to eat more fish. I remember seeing a poster in the Historical Society collections that said, eat more fish, they feed themselves, which is, you know, a picture of walleyes underwater swimming. And so they previously, it wasn't called the DNR, it was called the Game and Fish Department. And not Fish and Game. I'm always curious about why. Some places it's the Fish and Game, in other places it's the Game and Fish. Anyway, so they said, they had previously decided that Indians were among the worst flaunters of game and fish laws. And so they tried to prevent them from doing anything like commercializing fish. But suddenly they thought, you know, those Indian people at Mille Lacs, they really know how to fish. We'll get them to catch fish that we can then sell commercially. And soon, you know, the people in St. Paul will be eating more fish. And the meat can, I assume it's, you know, canned or dried meat sent to the soldiers in Europe. So they set up a whole thing for fishing at Mille Lacs, and they, you know, you can find records of how many different band members were doing it. In native women who were often the ones who went out and fished with nets in the lake and caught, you know, whitefish and what were the other ones that they would catch? Tullibees, I think, was one fish. Anyway, so that went on for a couple of years. And then the people along the South Shore got upset, decided to get upset. First of all, why are these people still here? They shouldn't be here anymore. Send them to White Earth. And then the second thing was, they're catching too many walleye, as you were saying, you know. So, you know, they might be fishing commercially, but if they accidentally catch a walleye, then they're decimating the game fish of our of our beautiful tourist paradise. And fewer tourists will come. And so complaints. There were meetings and people got all upset. That even the officials in the game and fish department, like, what was the name of that guy? That well-known guy who now has a game refuge named after him.
Carlos Avery.
Yes, Carlos Avery. Even Carlos Avery was in favor of the Mille Lacs Band continuing to fish. But, you know, the general opinion, and when you read where they say general opinion, what they mean is the general opinion of our constituents, the white people who live in towns like Isle and Onamia and Wakan, the towns along the South Shore. They didn't like it, so they had to find ways to stop it. And as a result, according to one source, Carlos Avery got axed from his, I don't know how many people know that about Carlos Avery, but he ceased to be the commissioner of game and fish in Minnesota because of that. But, they continued to rant about the Mille Lacs Band. It's completely predictable. So everything that happened later, like the complaints about in the 1990s, Bud Grant saying, they reached a settlement with the Mille Lacs Band where they would work out an arrangement involving fishing in Lake Mille Lacs and other places under the Treaty of 1837. And it was all agreed to, and then Bud Grant riled everyone enough to oppose it. What he didn't quite realize was that there were many band members who were opposed to it too, because they wanted more than the state had been willing to give them. And they got more. After the case went to court, they got a lot more. So, I don't know. Nobody ever got Bud Grant to say, yeah, kinda sorry we had such a good deal that I prevented from happening. But, because he was too stubborn, I think. But, somebody pointed out to me there was a calendar put out by a charity in which they got a whole bunch of famous people to do a photograph in which they pretended to carry out their fondest fantasy. And Bud Grant's fondest fantasy was, I kind of wish I was back in the day when the Indians were being treated so badly, because I think maybe I could have treated them better. And that was, just a couple of years before he opposed the settlement involving the Mille Lacs Band. Isn't that a fine story to tell your children? Anyway, the great beloved Bud Grant is added to the list of people in Minnesota history that I'd like to say some choice words. Anyway, any more questions? I think,
You've maybe already covered it, but I was just wondering, what is the most surprising thing that you ran across in your research?
I don't know, maybe it's the thing about the hotels. That was kind of, the thing is when you're doing historical research, you develop theories about stuff. You think, I really think that I'm finding out that, this will be the case. You develop a theory about a hypothesis. And then you'll be looking through some old box of papers, and there it'll be. It'll say you were exactly right. But my uncle used to love synchronicity. You know, you just randomly discover something. Damn it, I'm good. My theory is right. Anyway, so, you know, it is, sometimes you're surprised, but you also think, you knew it all along. I mean, there are historians in this room who were nodding their heads like, yeah. So, I don't know, I'm interested to know what the readers will read and be surprised about. Because, well, I don't know, maybe the surprising thing is that Henry Rice really was a scoundrel. But some of us always knew that. You know, I hate to tell you this, but my mother worked at the Minnesota Historical Society, and when I was in high school, she was organizing the Alexander Ramsey papers for microfilming. So I was getting a lot of, oh, he's such a nice guy, she would say. She said, I like him a lot better than that Henry Sibley. So she and her friend Rhoda Gilman, had this kind of rivalry about who was better, Henry Sibley or Alexander Ramsey. I listened to all this and ended up thinking that they were equally disgusting. So, any more? I appreciate you all coming, and it's even the ones who have probably heard some of this before. Thank you for coming.